March 10th, 1945. 1:14 a.m. Koto Ward, Tokyo. Michiko Tanaka died screaming in a concrete shelter that was supposed to save her. Her skin blistered and peeled from heat so intense that her hair ignited without touching flame. Her 8-year-old daughter Yuki had stopped breathing 2 minutes earlier. Her 12-year-old son Hiroshi went silent 90 seconds after that. Michiko spent the last 120 seconds of her life holding their bodies, knowing she had survived her children, knowing she would carry that knowledge into whatever came next. Then the superheated air cooked her lungs from the inside, and she died too. She was not alone. 100,000 people burned to death that night in Tokyo, more than Hiroshima, more than Nagasaki, combined. The single deadliest air raid in human history, and almost nobody knows this story. This is what happened in those 3 hours. March 9th, 1945, 10:07 p.m., 2 hours and 53 minutes earlier. Michiko woke to a sound she had never heard before. Not the air raid sirens, those she knew. Not the anti-aircraft guns, those were familiar. This was something else. A deep rumble that made the wooden walls of her house vibrate. She sat up in darkness, listening. Beside her, Yuki slept, curled in a ball. In the next room, Hiroshi was already awake. She could hear him moving. The rumble grew louder. Then she recognized it. Aircraft engines, hundreds of them, more than she had ever heard in 2 years of air raids. She stood and walked to the window. The sky was full of black shapes moving against the stars, flying low, much lower than usual. She started counting. 10, 20, 50. She stopped counting. There were too many. Hiroshi appeared in the doorway. "Mama, we should go to the shelter." "Not yet. Maybe they are passing over." "They are not passing over. Look." He pointed east. Orange light bloomed on the horizon. Then another. Then 5 more. Not the sharp flash of explosive bombs. Something softer. Something that spread instead of concentrated. Something that grew instead of faded. "Wake your sister. We go now." March 9th, 1945. 11:34 a.m., 13 hours earlier. Guam, Mariana Islands. Captain Robert Morgan stood in the briefing room with 300 other airmen and felt the floor drop out from under him. The colonel was speaking, but Morgan's brain kept hitting the same words over and over. 5,000 feet, incendiaries, residential areas, women and children. He forced himself to focus. The colonel had pulled down a map of Tokyo. Red circles marked target zones, all in the eastern wards, all densely populated, all civilian. Your payload will be M69 incendiary clusters. Each B-29 carries approximately 500 clusters. Each cluster contains 48 bomblets. Each bomblet is filled with jellied gasoline that ignites on impact and burns at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The bombardier paused. For reference, human bone begins to break down at 1,400 degrees. Wood ignites at 500 degrees. At 2,000 degrees, metal melts. Glass melts. People do not just burn, they vaporize. Someone in the back row said quietly, "Jesus Christ." The colonel continued as if he had not heard. Intelligence estimates 130,000 people per square mile in the target area. Construction is primarily wood and paper. Streets are narrow. Fire breaks are minimal. Wind conditions tonight are optimal. 15 mile per hour winds from the northwest. No rain for 3 weeks. Humidity at 45%. When you ignite the target area, the fire will create its own weather system. We are calling it a firestorm. Morgan raised his hand. "Sir, what is the strategic objective? Which factories are we targeting?" The colonel looked directly at him. "Captain, there are no factories in this target zone. The objective is to destroy Japanese civilian morale and eliminate cottage industry production." Approximately 40% of Japanese military supplies are produced in home workshops scattered throughout residential areas. We cannot target individual buildings. We target the entire district. Morgan's mouth was dry. Sir, that is 500,000 people. Correct. And before you ask about American casualties, let me remind you that Marines are dying on Iwo Jima as we speak. The Joint Chiefs estimate 1 million American casualties if we invade mainland Japan. 1 million. This operation will save American lives by forcing Japanese surrender. That is the mission. You take off at 17 hours. Dismissed. Morgan walked out into the sunlight and vomited behind the barracks. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Jackson, found him there 5 minutes later. You all right, sir? No. Morgan wiped his mouth. I am not all right. We just got ordered to burn 500,000 people alive. We got ordered to end a war that has already killed 400,000 Americans. Morgan looked at him. Does that make it right? Jackson did not answer. Morgan thought about his brother, Jimmy, 20 years old, Marine Corps, currently somewhere in the Pacific, probably getting shot at by Japanese soldiers armed with weapons made in those exact home workshops the colonel had mentioned. If burning Tokyo saved Jimmy's life, was it murder or was it mathematics? He did not know. He had 6 hours to figure it out. March 10th, 1945. 12:11 a.m., Koto Ward, Tokyo. Michiko pulled her children through streets that had transformed into hell. The sky was raining fire, not bombs, actual fire. Small cylinders falling from darkness, splitting open on impact, spraying burning jelly that stuck to everything it touched. Skin, clothing, wood, water. It stuck to water and kept burning. A cylinder landed 3 meters ahead. It burst and fire splashed across the street. Michiko felt the heat hit her face like a fist. She yanked Yuki left into an alley, running between houses that were already smoking. Behind her, someone screamed. She turned. An old woman, maybe 70 years old, was on fire. Rolling on the ground, shrieking, Yuki screamed, "Mama, help her!" Michiko took 1 step toward the woman. Then Hiroshi grabbed her arm. His voice was steady, adult, terrifying. "Mama, she is dead already. If we stop, we die too." Yuki was crying. "We have to help." Michiko looked at the burning woman, looked at her daughter. 3 seconds to choose. Save a stranger and lose both children, or run and live with the choice forever. She chose. She turned and ran. The old woman's screams followed her down the alley, through the smoke, into her memory where they would replay every night for the next 74 minutes until Michiko died too. They reached the neighborhood shelter. 70 people packed into a space designed for 40. A man at the door was shouting, "Hurry! Get inside! Close the door before the fire spreads!" Michiko shoved her children through the crowd. The shelter was dark, lit by 2 oil lamps. It smelled like sweat and urine and fear. Someone was praying. A baby was crying. The walls shook from explosions above. An old man near the door had a radio. The announcer's voice was shaking. Multiple firestorms confirmed across Koto, Sumida, Arakawa, and Honjo wards. Fire department reports they cannot control the spread. Winds increasing. Water mains destroyed. Citizens are advised to evacuate to designated safe areas. Someone laughed. It was not a sane sound. "Evacuate where? The entire east side is burning." The old man turned off the radio. "We wait here until morning. The shelter is reinforced concrete. We are safe." Michiko held her children and tried to believe him. March 10th, 1945. 12:17 a.m. B-29 City of Los Angeles, 5,200 feet above Tokyo. Morgan looked through the bomb site and saw hell on earth. The entire eastern half of Tokyo was one continuous sea of flame stretching from horizon to horizon, not scattered fires. One unified inferno. The heat was so intense he could feel it at 5,000 feet. The air currents were so violent they were tossing his B-29 around like a toy. He could see people in the streets, tiny black figures running, falling, burning. He watched a woman carrying something, probably a child, running down a street that was fire on both sides. He watched her turn a corner. The corner was fire too. He watched her stop, just stop, and disappear into flame. Release point in 30 seconds. Morgan's hand was on the bomb release. 6 tons of M69 incendiaries, 500 clusters, 24,000 individual bomblets, each one filled with jellied gasoline that would stick to human skin and burn straight through to bone. He thought about Jimmy. Last letter 3 weeks ago, somewhere in the Pacific. Probably Iwo Jima. Probably in a foxhole right now getting shelled by artillery made in Tokyo factories. 20 seconds. He thought about the woman with the child. The one who had just burned alive while he watched. 15 seconds. Mathematics or murder. Save American lives or become a mass killer. Win a war or lose his soul. 10 seconds. Both. It was both. That was the truth nobody wanted to say. This was necessary, and it was evil. It would save lives, and it would destroy them. He would go home a hero, and he would never sleep without nightmares again. 5 seconds. Release. The plane lurched upward as 6 tons dropped away. Morgan kept his eye to the bomb site, forcing himself to watch. The clusters tumbled through smoke, broke apart at 2,000 feet, scattered across a neighborhood that was already burning. He saw them impact, saw new fires bloom where there had been only darkness, saw a building collapse, saw people running from one death into another. He pulled back from the bomb site and vomited into his oxygen mask. The vomit splashed against the rubber, splattered back onto his face. He could not take the mask off at 5,000 feet, could not breathe without it. So he wore his own vomit for the next 4 hours of the mission, feeling it cold and wet against his skin, tasting it with every breath. He wanted to remember. He wanted it to hurt. Below him, 24,000 bomblets ignited, and people started dying in ways that would give him nightmares for the next 40 years. March 10th, 1945. 12:52 a.m., Kodo Ward Shelter. Michiko felt the temperature rising and knew they were going to die. At first the shelter had been cool, then warm, then hot. Now it was unbearable. She could hear people gasping for air. The baby had stopped crying 10 minutes ago. That was worse than the crying because it meant the baby was either dead or too weak to make sound. Someone tried the door. The metal handle burned his hand. He screamed and stumbled back. "We are trapped. The fire is directly outside." Panic moved through the crowd like a living thing. People pushed toward the door, then away from it, toward the ventilation shaft, then away from that. 70 people with nowhere to go, slowly cooking alive in a concrete box. Michiko held Yuki and Hiroshi close. She could smell smoke pouring through the ventilation shaft, could feel heat radiating through the concrete walls. The walls were designed to protect them from explosions. Instead, they were trapping the heat, turning the shelter into an oven. Yuki whispered, "Mama, I cannot breathe. I know, baby, I know." Hiroshi said nothing. His face was pressed against her shoulder. She could feel his tears soaking through her dress. 12 years old, and he knew exactly what was happening. A man near the ventilation shaft screamed, "The air! The air is burning!" Michiko looked up. She could see it. heat shimmer coming down the shaft. The temperature outside had risen so high that the air itself was becoming fire. She had read about this in civil defense pamphlets. In intense fires, air temperature can exceed 1,800 degrees. At that temperature, human lungs cook from a single breath. The pamphlet had not mentioned what that looked like. Now she was learning. The man who had screamed was on the ground, convulsing, clawing at his throat. He had breathed the superheated air. It had seared his lungs. He was drowning in his own cooked tissue. Others started to panic, screaming, pushing, fighting for breathable air that did not exist anymore. Michiko pulled her children to the floor where the air was slightly cooler. She covered their mouths with cloth torn from her dress, whispered the only words left that meant anything. I love you so much. The lights went out. Someone was screaming. Someone else was praying. The temperature kept rising. March 10th, 1945. 1:14 a.m. The ventilation shaft collapsed. Superheated air rushed into the shelter at 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Every person inside was dead in 90 seconds. Michiko felt Yuki go limp at 1:14 and 23 seconds. Felt Hiroshi stop breathing at 1:15 and 47 seconds. She spent the next 120 seconds understanding that she had survived her children, that she would spend eternity knowing she had watched them die, that following orders and trusting the government and believing the shelter would save them had killed her family. At 1:17 and 51 seconds, the heat took her too. Above ground, 334 American B-29 bombers continued dropping incendiaries on Tokyo for 2 more hours. By sunrise, 16 square miles of the city had burned to ash. 100,000 people were dead. 1 million were homeless. Not a single American aircraft was shot down. Captain Robert Morgan landed at Guam at 9:47 a.m., climbed out of his B-29, and walked directly to the medical tent where he requested a psychiatric evaluation. The request was denied. He flew 16 more missions over Japan before the war ended. He never stopped having nightmares about the woman with 2 children running down a burning street. He never knew her name was Michiko Tanaka. March 10th, 1945. 6:43 a.m., Kodo Ward, Tokyo. Takeshi Yamamoto was 16 years old, and he opened the shelter door to find that his entire world had ceased to exist. The door was hot to the touch even 6 hours after the bombing stopped. When it swung open, gray light flooded in, and with it came a smell that Takeshi would never forget. Burnt wood, burnt metal, burnt flesh, all mixed together into something that made him gag and cover his mouth. He stepped outside. The street was gone, not damaged, gone. Where there had been houses and shops and trees, there was now flat gray ash stretching in every direction. No buildings, no walls, just endless gray wasteland with occasional black shapes that might have been cars or carts or bodies. He could not tell. Behind him, the other survivors from the shelter emerged. 23 people had crowded into the military bunker on the edge of the ward. 23 out of a neighborhood that had held 8,000. Takeshi could do the math. He had studied engineering. He understood percentages. 99.7% casualty rate. Those were not war numbers. Those were extinction numbers. An old man beside him fell to his knees and started screaming. Not words, just sound. Pure grief compressed into noise. Takeshi wanted to join him, but his body would not cooperate. He just stood there, staring at nothing, feeling nothing, thinking one thought over and over. Where is my mother? She had been at the textile factory 3 kilometers east when the bombing started. That entire district was now gray ash. A woman grabbed his arm. She was maybe 40, her face covered in soot. Help me, please. My children were in a shelter on 4th Street. Help me find them." Takeshi looked where 4th Street used to be. There was nothing there. No street, no shelter, no children, just ash. But he nodded anyway, because what else could he do? They walked together into the wasteland, searching for landmarks that no longer existed, looking for people who were already dead. They found the shelter at 7:15 a.m., or rather, they found where the shelter had been. The entrance was collapsed. The concrete walls were cracked from heat. Takeshi pulled at the rubble with his bare hands. The woman pulled beside him. They cleared the entrance after 20 minutes. Takeshi looked inside and immediately turned away, vomiting into the ash. The woman pushed past him, looked into the shelter, made a sound that was not quite a scream and not quite a moan. Then she climbed inside. Takeshi wanted to stop her, wanted to pull her back, but he did not. He just stood there listening to her calling names into darkness. Yuki, Hiroshi, Mama, please, please. The names echoed in the concrete tomb. Nobody answered. She emerged 10 minutes later. Her hands were burned from touching bodies that were still hot. She looked at Takeshi with eyes that had gone somewhere else, somewhere beyond grief, beyond sanity. They are all dead, all of them, everyone. I know. What do we do now? Takeshi had no answer, so they just stood there in the ash, 2 survivors in a dead city, while the sun rose over Tokyo and revealed the full scope of the horror. March 11th, 1945. 8:15 a.m., 26 hours later. Guam, Mariana Islands. General Curtis LeMay stood in front of a map of Japan and felt nothing but cold satisfaction. The reconnaissance photos were spread across his desk. Tokyo before and after. The difference was staggering. 16 square miles of dense urban area reduced to ash. 100,000 estimated casualties. 1 million homeless. War production in the target area. 0. His aide, Colonel Williams, stood beside him. "Sir, the mission was a complete success. We lost 0 aircraft to enemy fire. All crews returned safely. The firestorm exceeded projections." LeMay lit a cigar. "Good. When can we do it again?" "Sir, I want target assessments for Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and Yokohama. Similar profiles, densely packed residential areas, wood construction, high wind conditions. I want them burned to the ground within 2 weeks." Williams hesitated. "Sir, there are concerns from some of the crew. Psychological stress. Some of the bombardiers are requesting reassignment." LeMay looked at him with flat, cold eyes. "Denied. Every bombardier who flew last night knew exactly what the mission was. They dropped their ordnance, and they will continue to drop their ordnance until Japan surrenders, or there is nothing left to burn. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir. The crews need to understand something." LeMay walked to the map and tapped Tokyo with his finger. "Every Japanese civilian working in a home factory is a combatant. Every woman sewing uniforms is supporting the war effort. Every child carrying supplies is part of the logistics chain. There are no innocents in total war. There are only people who have not yet been defeated. My job is to defeat them. By fire, if necessary. By starvation, if necessary. By whatever means necessary. And if that makes me a war criminal, then I will be a war criminal who wins." Williams said nothing. There was nothing to say. LeMay had made his decision, and 100,000 people were dead because of it. The only question now was how many more would die before Japan surrendered. LeMay pulled out casualty projections for the planned invasion of Japan. Operation Downfall. Estimated American casualties, 1.7 to 4 million. Estimated Japanese casualties, 5 to 10 million. Those were the numbers if America invaded conventionally. Ground forces, island by island, fighting Japanese soldiers who had been ordered to fight to the death. Or he could burn Japan to ash from the air and force surrender without invasion. Kill 100,000 to save millions. That was not a hard choice. That was mathematics. He picked up the phone and called Washington. "This is LeMay. I need authorization for expanded firebombing operations." "Yes, sir. Similar to Tokyo. Estimated casualties per raid, 50,000 to 100,000. "Yes, sir. I understand the political concerns. But if you want to save American lives, this is how we do it. We burn them until they surrender." He hung up, looked at Williams. "Prepare mission briefings for Nagoya. Target date, March 19th. We have 9 days. March 15th, 1945. 5 days later, Osaka University Hospital. Dr. Kimura Hiroshi had been a surgeon for 23 years, and he had never seen injuries like this. The burns were not like normal burns. They were deeper, more extensive, and they did not heal. The jellied gasoline had burned straight through skin, through muscle, in some cases down to bone. And the patients who survived the initial burning were dying anyway from infections that his limited medical supplies could not treat. The hospital had been overwhelmed since March 10th. Every bed filled, patients in the hallways, patients in the courtyards. Over 2,000 burn victims from Tokyo alone, transported by train to Osaka because Tokyo's hospitals had burned down, and more arriving every day. Kimura walked through the ward and tried not to see them as people. If he saw them as people, if he let himself think about their families and their lives and their futures, he would break. So he saw them as medical cases. Patient 347, third-degree burns over 70% of body. Prognosis, death within 48 hours. Patient 348, second-degree burns over 40% of body. Smoke inhalation damage to lungs. Prognosis, death within 1 week. He stopped at bed 361. A young man, maybe 17, with burns covering his arms and face. The boy was conscious, which was unusual. Most patients this badly burned were kept sedated, but they had run out of morphine 3 days ago. Now patients just suffered awake. The boy looked at him. "Doctor, am I going to die?" Kimura considered lying. Decided against it. The boy deserved truth. "Yes, the infection is spreading. We do not have the antibiotics to stop it. I am sorry." The boy nodded. He had known. They all knew. How long? 2 days, maybe 3. The boy closed his eyes. "I was supposed to start university this year, engineering. I wanted to build bridges." Kimura felt something crack inside his chest. He had been holding himself together through 5 days of hell, and this boy who wanted to build bridges was the thing that finally broke him. "I am sorry. I am so sorry. It is not your fault, doctor." The boy opened his eyes. They were clear, accepting. This is war. People die in war. I just did not think it would be like this. I thought soldiers died. I did not know that everyone dies. Kimura had no answer, because the boy was right. This was not war. War was soldiers fighting soldiers. This was extermination. This was the deliberate targeting of civilians with weapons designed to cause maximum suffering. This was something new, something worse. He moved to the next bed. Patient 362, patient 363, patient 364, all dying, all knowing they were dying, all accepting it with quiet dignity that made Kimura want to scream. By the end of his shift, 16 patients had died. Tomorrow, another 16 would die, and the day after that, and the Americans would keep bombing. Nagoya was scheduled for March 19th, according to radio reports. Another 50,000 casualties, another wave of patients he could not save. Kimura walked out of the hospital at midnight and looked up at the clear night sky. Somewhere up there, American bombers were flying, planning, preparing, loading incendiaries, getting ready to burn another city, and there was nothing he could do to stop them. March 20th, 1945, Washington, D.C., Office of War Information. James Harrison was 32 years old, a public relations officer, and he had just been handed a problem that could destroy American public support for the war. The preliminary casualty reports from Tokyo: 100,000 dead, almost all civilians, almost all women, children, and elderly, burned alive in the largest air raid in human history. His supervisor, Mr. Patterson, dropped the file on his desk. We need to control this narrative before it becomes a political disaster. The press is starting to ask questions. How many casualties? What were the targets? Were they military or civilian? Harrison opened the file. Read the mission briefing, felt his stomach turn. This is a firebombing of residential areas. There were no military targets. Patterson nodded. Which is why we do not say that. We say we targeted industrial districts with significant military production. We emphasize Japanese home factories producing war materials. We frame this as destroying enemy manufacturing capacity, not killing civilians. But 100,000 people are dead. And how many American lives will that save? Patterson leaned forward. Look, Harrison, I understand this is ugly, but we are fighting an enemy that started this war with a surprise attack that killed 2,400 Americans. An enemy that tortures prisoners. An enemy that will fight to the last man if we invade their homeland. If burning their cities forces them to surrender and saves even one American life, then it is justified. Our job is to make sure the American people understand that. Harrison looked at the casualty photos. Charred bodies, melted streets, children burned beyond recognition. How do I make people understand this? You do not show them the photos. You show them numbers, abstract numbers. You say, enemy industrial capacity destroyed, not 100,000 civilians burned alive. You say, strategic bombing shortened the war, not we dropped napalm on residential neighborhoods. Language matters, framing matters. The truth is whatever we tell people it is. Harrison wanted to argue, wanted to say that lying about mass civilian casualties was morally wrong. But Patterson was right about one thing. This bombing would save American lives, and Harrison's brother was in the Marines, currently sailing toward Okinawa. If burning Tokyo meant his brother came home alive, what price was too high? He picked up the press release draft, started writing. Strategic firebombing operations successfully destroyed key industrial targets in Tokyo. Enemy war production significantly degraded. American forces suffered 0 casualties. Operations will continue until Japanese surrender is achieved. He did not mention the 100,000 dead. He did not mention the children. He did not mention that the entire operation had been designed from the beginning to kill civilians and break morale. He wrote a lie that would become history. And 60 years later, most Americans still would not know that their country had committed the deadliest air raid in human history. March 25th, 1945. Koto Ward, Tokyo. Takeshi Yamamoto stood in the ruins of his neighborhood and tried to remember what his mother's face looked like. It had been 15 days, and already the memory was fading. He could remember her voice, could remember her laugh. But her face was becoming unclear, like a photograph left in the sun too long. He had not found her body. The textile factory where she worked was now a flat plain of ash. No bodies, no remains, just gray dust that might have been buildings or might have been people. Takeshi had sifted through the ash for 3 days before accepting the truth. His mother was gone, not just dead, erased, reduced to atoms and scattered by wind. Around him, survivors were beginning to rebuild. not houses. There was no material for houses, but shelters, lean-tos made from scrap metal and burnt wood. Thousands of people living in the ruins of their city because they had nowhere else to go. An old man approached him. "You are Yamamoto's boy, yes? The engineer student?" Takeshi nodded. "Good. We need help. The water system is destroyed. We need to dig wells. You understand engineering. Help us." Takeshi wanted to say no, wanted to lie down in the ash and wait to die like his mother had died. But the old man was looking at him with desperate hope, and Takeshi found himself nodding. "I will help." They spent the next 3 days digging. 12 hours a day, hands bleeding, backs aching, digging through ash and rubble to reach water. On the 3rd day, they struck water. Clean water. The survivors cheered. It was the first good thing that had happened in 16 days. That night, Takeshi sat by the new well and looked at the stars. Somewhere up there, American bombers were flying. Tomorrow or the next day or the day after that, they would come again. They would burn another city, kill another 100,000 people. And the survivors would dig wells and build shelters and keep living because that was all they could do. He thought about his mother, about her dream that he would become an engineer and build bridges, bridges that connected things, bridges that brought people together. He made a decision. He would survive. He would become an engineer. And someday, when this war was over, he would build something, not weapons, not instruments of death, something that created instead of destroyed. He did not know what yet, but he would build something that mattered. 15 years later, Takeshi Yamamoto would help design the Tokyo Sky Tree, but that is another story. March 28, 2025. Tokyo General Hospital, room 314. Yuki Tanaka was 88 years old and dying. Cancer. The doctors gave her 3 weeks. She had been alive for 29,219 days, and she remembered exactly one of them. March 10th, 1945. The night she was 8 years old and everyone around her burned to death. The night she should have died, but did not. The night that 80 years later still woke her up, screaming. Her granddaughter Akiko sat beside the bed, holding her hand. "Grandma, why do you always light a candle on March 10th? Yuki looked at the ceiling. Her voice was weak but clear. "Because I am the last one who remembers. When I die, the story dies with me. 100,000 people burned to death that night. More than Hiroshima, more than Nagasaki, and almost nobody knows. I did not know. Nobody does. That is the point." She closed her eyes. "In 3 weeks, I will be dead. And the last person who can say I was there, I saw it, it happened, will be gone. Then it becomes just another Wikipedia article that nobody reads, another footnote in a history book, another tragedy that the world decided to forget." Akiko squeezed her hand. "Tell me what happened, please, before it is too late." Yuki opened her eyes, looked at her granddaughter, and for the first time in 40 years, she told the story. March 10th, 1945. 1:47 a.m., 80 years earlier. Kodo Ward Shelter. Yuki was 8 years old and she could not breathe. The air in the shelter was so hot it burned her throat. Her mother Michiko was holding her, covering her mouth with cloth, whispering, "I love you," over and over. Her brother Hiroshi was pressed against them, silent, his body shaking. Then the ventilation shaft collapsed. Superheated air rushed in. Yuki felt her mother's body go rigid, felt Hiroshi stop moving, felt the cloth over her mouth getting hotter and hotter until it started to smoke. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her lungs were burning. Her skin was burning. Everything was burning. She closed her eyes and waited to die. She did not die. She did not know why. Maybe because her mother's body shielded her from the worst of the heat. Maybe because she was small and the coolest air settled at the floor. Maybe because God hated her and wanted her to survive so she could spend the rest of her life knowing she lived while everyone else burned. When she opened her eyes again, it was quiet. No screaming, no crying, no movement, just silence and darkness and the smell of cooked meat that she would never forget. She tried to move, could not. Her mother's body was on top of her, heavy and still. She pushed. The body did not move. She pushed harder, started crying, started screaming. Nobody answered. She stayed there for 11 hours, 8 years old, trapped under her dead mother, surrounded by 71 corpses in a concrete tomb. When rescuers finally opened the shelter at noon, they found one survivor, a little girl who would not speak, who just stared at nothing with empty eyes. Yuki did not talk for 6 months after that. When she finally did, nobody wanted to hear what she had to say. March 10th, 1946. 1 year later, Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. Defense attorney Jonathan Marks stood in the courtroom and tried one last time to make them see the hypocrisy. Your Honor, I submit evidence regarding the Allied firebombing campaign against Japanese cities. Operation Meeting House alone killed 103,000 civilians. The mission briefings clearly state that residential areas were deliberately targeted to break civilian morale. The American prosecutor objected. Allied military operations are not on trial here. The judge, an American general, agreed. Sustained. This tribunal exists to prosecute Japanese war crimes, not to evaluate Allied conduct. Marks pressed forward. Your Honor, my client General Yamashita is accused of responsibility for the Manila massacre that killed 25,000 Filipino civilians. If deliberately killing civilians is a war crime, then what do we call an operation that deliberately killed 103,000 Japanese civilians? The courtroom went silent. Everyone understood what was happening. If deliberately killing civilians was a war crime, then Curtis LeMay belonged in the defendant's chair. The judge made his decision. The context matters, Counselor. Japan started this war with an attack that killed American civilians at Pearl Harbor. Japan massacred civilians throughout Asia. The rape of Nanking killed 300,000 Chinese. Unit 731 conducted biological experiments on living prisoners. The Manila massacre was an act of terror with no military purpose. The Allied bombing campaign, while tragic, served the strategic goal of forcing Japanese surrender and preventing an invasion that would have killed millions. Intent matters. Context matters. The charges against General Yamashita stand. Mark sat down. He had just watched history being written in real time. When the victors kill civilians, it is strategic necessity. When the losers kill civilians, it is a war crime. The definition of morality depends entirely on who wins. General Yamashita was hanged 3 months later. Curtis LeMay was promoted. Neither man ever apologized for civilian deaths, but only one went into history books as a war criminal. April 15th, 1952. 7 years later, Smithsonian Institution, Washington, D.C. Museum curator Helen Morrison held a diary in her hands and felt sick. It was a survivor's testimony from the Tokyo firebombing, translated from Japanese, written by a woman named Michiko Tanaka, who died in a shelter with her 2 children. The last entry was March 9th, 1945. Tomorrow I am taking the children to visit my sister. I hope the weather is nice. There was no March 10th entry, because on March 10th, Michiko and her children burned to death. Helen's supervisor, Dr. Patterson, walked over. "Are you including that in the exhibit?" I was considering it. "This is powerful testimony." Patterson shook his head. "Helen, I need you to understand something. This museum exists to honor American sacrifice and celebrate American victory. The Tokyo firebombing is complicated. It raises questions that Americans are not ready to answer 7 years after winning the war. But it happened. Over 100,000 people died, and millions more would have died if we invaded Japan. That is the context. That is the story we tell." Patterson picked up the diary. "We mentioned the strategic bombing campaign in one paragraph. We focus on the atomic bombs because they are simpler. New technology, clear cause and effect. Dropped bombs, Japan surrendered, war ended. Clean narrative. The firebombing is messy. We do not do messy. So we just hide this, we archive it." Patterson placed the diary in a box marked Tokyo Operations, Secondary Sources. "Maybe in 50 years historians will want it, but not now. Not yet. Right now, Americans want to feel good about winning the war. Let them." Helen watched the box get carried away. She wrote the exhibit text that afternoon. Allied strategic bombing operations successfully degraded Japanese war production and contributed to enemy surrender. One sentence, repeated so many times it became accepted truth. The exhibit opened in May 1952. Over the next decade, 15 million people visited. Almost none of them learned that the deadliest air raid in history killed more people than the atomic bomb. Japan did the same thing. The museums in Tokyo mentioned Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They did not mention Nanking or Unit 731 or the Death March. Both countries had decided that some memories were too complicated. Both countries chose forgetting over reckoning. March 10th, 1975. 30 years later. Tokyo. Takeshi Yamamoto stood at a small memorial in Yokohama. 37 people had gathered to remember the firebombing. 37 out of 1,000,000 survivors. Most were dead now. In another 20 years, they would all be gone. A young reporter approached him. "Are you a survivor?" "Yes. I was 16. I lost my mother and sister. Can I interview you for a story?" Takeshi laughed bitterly. "Will it be on the front page? Will people finally learn what happened?" The reporter looked embarrassed. "Probably page 8, maybe 500 words. That is what I thought. Nobody wants to remember. Too complicated. We rebuilt. We became allies with America. Easier to forget than to reconcile. And your generation does not care. Ancient history." The reporter did not argue. He knew Takeshi was right. That night, Takeshi went home and pulled out the only photograph that had survived the fire. His mother, his sister, himself, taken in 1942. He looked at his mother's face and tried to remember her voice. 30 years and the memory was fading like a photograph left in sunlight too long. He wondered if anyone would remember when his generation died. He suspected they would not. He was right. March 10th, 2025. 50 years later. Phoenix, Arizona. Michael Torres sat in American history class learning about World War II. His teacher, Mr. Wilson, was explaining the end of the war. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, killed approximately 70,000 people and finally convinced Japan to surrender. It was a terrible necessity that saved millions of American and Japanese lives. Michael raised his hand. "Mr. Wilson, I read online that America firebombed Tokyo and killed more people than Hiroshima. Is that true?" Mr. Wilson paused. He knew it was true. He had studied history. He knew about Operation Meeting House. He also knew it was not in the curriculum. not in the textbook, not on the test. He made a choice. The United States conducted strategic bombing operations against Japanese industrial capacity throughout the war. The atomic bombs are significant because they represented new technology and convinced Japanese leadership that further resistance was futile. That is what you need to know for the exam. Michael wrote it down. Strategic bombing, industrial capacity. He did not ask about casualties, did not ask about civilians. He moved on to the next topic. That night, he mentioned the lesson to his grandfather, Richard Torres. "Grandpa, did you ever bomb Tokyo?" Richard was 82 years old. He had been a bombardier. He had flown on March 10th, 1945. He looked out the window for a long time before answering. "Yes, I was there. I dropped incendiaries on residential neighborhoods. I killed people, women and children. I knew what I was doing, and I did it because those were my orders, and I believed it would end the war." Did it? Yes. Japan surrendered 4 months later. Maybe because of the atomic bombs. Maybe because of the firebombing. Maybe because Russia invaded Manchuria. Probably all three. Richard turned to look at his grandson. "You know what haunts me? Not that I did it. War is war. What haunts me is that nobody remembers. We killed 100,000 people in one night. More than Hiroshima. But everyone remembers Hiroshima. Nobody remembers Tokyo, and I understand why. Hiroshima is clean. New weapon, instant deaths, clear narrative. Tokyo firebombing is ugly. Slow deaths, deliberate targeting of civilians, makes people ask uncomfortable questions. So we stopped talking about it. And now it is gone." Michael did not know what to say. Richard continued. "I went to a veterans reunion in 1987. Another bombardier started crying, said he could still smell the burning, said it never went away. Everyone went quiet. Then someone changed the subject. We never talked about it again. He died in 1992. Heart attack. But I think it was guilt. I think he carried it for 47 years, and it killed him." "Do you feel guilty?" Richard thought about it. "I feel like we did something necessary and something terrible. Both things are true. We shortened the war. We also burned 100,000 civilians alive, and then we lied about it and forgot about it. That is the part I cannot forgive. Not the killing, the forgetting." March 28th, 2025. Tokyo General Hospital, room 314. Yuki finished her story. Akiko was crying, still holding her grandmother's hand. "Why did you never talk about this before?" "Because nobody wanted to hear it, and because remembering hurts." She closed her eyes. "For 80 years I asked why I survived. Why me and not the other 71 people in that shelter? Why me and not my mother, who was a good person, who never hurt anyone? I never got an answer. Maybe there is no answer. Maybe I survived so I could tell this story. Maybe that is the only reason. I will tell people, I promise." Yuki smiled sadly. "No, you will not. Not because you are bad. Because people do not want to know. They want simple stories with clear heroes and villains. This story is complicated. Both sides did terrible things. Both sides forgot. Both sides moved on. You will try to tell people, and they will change the subject, just like they did with me." 3 weeks later, Yuki Tanaka died. Her obituary mentioned she was a survivor of the Tokyo firebombing. 2 newspapers ran the story. 47 people attended her funeral. Akiko went home that night and found her grandmother's box of documents, letters, photographs, a diary. She opened the diary. The first page was dated March 12th, 1945. "I am alive. I do not know why. Everyone else is dead." Akiko read for 3 hours, learned about the shelter, about the heat, about lying under her mother's body for 11 hours, about 6 months of silence, about 80 years of survivor's guilt. She closed the diary, opened her laptop, typed Tokyo firebombing March 10, 1945, read the Wikipedia article, 100,000 dead, largest air raid in history, more casualties than Hiroshima. She had never heard of it. Nobody she knew had heard of it. She thought about posting something on social media, thought about telling her friends. Then she remembered her grandmother's words. People do not want to know. She put the diary in a drawer. Maybe someday she would do something with it, write a book, make a documentary, tell the story, but probably not. The next day she went back to work, back to her life. The story of March 10th, 1945, faded back into the drawer where it had lived for 80 years. That is how forgetting works. Not dramatically, not violently, just quietly, one generation at a time, until nobody remembers, until nobody is left to remember.